Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. Like Dan mentioned, from Google ATOP, it stands for Advanced Technology and Projects. It's mostly a hardware innovation lab that I'm currently working at. But today I'm going to talk more about work I did when I was at Berkeley Lab. And this is a very exciting topic for me since it's kind of combining science, and I come from a physics or academic background, and it combines machine learning or NLP, which is also something I'm super passionate about. And what I want to talk about today is, I think, is a very good example of how combining some very simple machine learning techniques with domain expertise could produce very useful results. And you don't always have to pick the most complex ML model or have a crazy large GPU to make a useful machine learning model. And I think that this will be focused on the material science, and the subtitle here is Word2Vec Learns Material Science, which is pretty much what we did. And kind of more generally, I think I'll try to talk about how unsupervised natural language processing can predict scientific discoveries way in advance. So since this is going to be about Word2Vec quite a bit, I'll do a quick Word2Vec recap. Most of you probably already know about this algorithm since it's pretty old by now and pretty famous. And then I'll talk about what happens when you apply this to material science. And then I'll discuss, I think, one of the key ideas here, that you can use the dot product, like just a vector product, for hypothesis generation. And I'll talk how we can use this idea to predict functional applications for materials many years before the actual discovery. And at the end, I'll try to talk about what's next, since this work has already been out for more than a year. So I think it's interesting to think about what could be done next. So I want to start with this famous quote from John Rupert Firth, who was a famous British linguist in 1950s. And the quote says, "You shall know a word by a company it keeps." And I think this doesn't necessarily only apply to words. It could apply to many things, but the phrase as is probably one of the key concepts of NLP these days. So usually you use the context of the word, the context of the token or the phrase to build some representation for that word. So, and the first time one of the first times this idea was used very efficiently and became very popular was with the Word2Vec algorithm from 2013. The paper is here. There was also a follow-up paper in 2014 building on this. And the idea is, if you have a text, or in this case a sentence, "the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," you train a very simple one hidden layer neural network to predict context words, which in this case are these white ones, even a target word, which in this case is word "the." So for this example, you would have two training examples, even the word "the," predict quick and predict brown. And then you move over, and then you have three more examples for the input quick, predict the, brown, and fox, and so on. You loop over your whole corpus. There is no human labeling. So this is usually called unsupervised or sometimes self-supervised learning, because the algorithm is supervising itself given a piece of text. And this image is actually taken from Mick McCormick's blog, and this is a very nice tutorial on Word2Vec. So if you want to know in a bit more detail, I would encourage you to follow this link. So more technically, like the intuition here is, so here we have a neural network, and it's one hidden layer with 200 neurons. This number is arbitrary. Usually a number between 50 and 1,000 works fairly well. And then you have an input layer where, assuming you have a vocabulary of, in this case, 500,000 words, each word has an index in that vocabulary. In this case, I've chosen these two very similar material formula, which in our case are just words. and assume this one has an index 5 and this one has an index 8. And this arrows represents the weight of the hidden layer. And then it goes to the hidden layer, goes to the output layer, which is softmax classifier. And the classifier predicts the context word. So in this case, the context words for lithium cobalt oxide maybe were cathodes, electrochemical, etc. And the output of this network is a probability distribution over all words, over the whole vocabulary. So what's the likelihood that the word next to lithium cobalt oxide would be cathodes? So now if you think about this, if you have two very similar words, this probability distributions would be very similar. So for the neural network to output very similar probability distributions, the hidden layer weights, so these arrows for this position and this position, would have to be very similar. And that's the main idea, that similar words that occur in similar context and similar sentences would get similar weights in the hidden layer of the network. So if you just take the hidden layer weights and call them embeddings, you can do a one-to-one match for a row in the hidden layer weights to a word. And this will be an embedding that represents the word. So the outcome of this training is basically this weight matrix, which has 500, in this case, 500,000 rows for the size of vocabulary and 200 columns for the size of the embedding. And each row here is a word embedding. And then you also have the output layer weights. I've called this O for now. And then this is just 200 times 500,000, which is used at this output layer here to map an embedding to a context word probability. So what happens here, if you take a word embedding and multiply it by this output matrix and run it through a softmax, you get a probability that a randomly chosen word near lithium cobalt oxide is the word cathodes. So usually when people train word2vec, they throw away this output layer and just keep the word embeddings, and then word embeddings are used in subsequent tasks. So we are not going to do that. So I want you to keep this thing in mind for now, and then let's see what happens when we go to material science. So usually word2vec is trained on like a large text corpus, Common Crawl or Wikipedia. We took a very specialized text corpus where we took scientific abstracts. So we pulled 3.3 million abstracts. The nice thing with abstracts is they're freely available using some APIs from publishers usually. And then out of this 1.5 millions were inorganic material science. This classifier is pretty straightforward to do using some standard NLP. So, and this is not a very crucial step, but the key here is we made it even more specialized. And then the size of the corpus ended up being 300 million words. And to give you a comparison, Wikipedia is something like 4 billion words. So it's not a very large corpus, about 10 times more than Wikipedia. And then we had 500,000 unique words and 100,000 materials formula, again, highlighting that this is very specialized. And here I put a link to the list of papers that we actually used if anyone wants to go and try to reproduce this. So what happens when you have such a specialized corpus, then the similarities are also going to be very specialized. So the way, and I think keeping in mind the idea that similar words should have similar embeddings, you can do a ranking based on similarity. So you could take a keyword, and then you want to find words that are most similar to this keyword by doing a dot product, a vector product between word embeddings of the whole vocabulary, and then getting a similarity score and ranking by the similarity. So you have a vector and you take the closest vector to this keyword, say this is the most similar word. And when we did this for materials, for instance, one example is you can take a magnetic property, ferromagnetic, and then the most similar ones would be a bunch of other magnetic properties, which is good news. Or if you take a battery material, lithium-ion battery material, lithium cobalt oxide. This is the very common one is likely the battery in your phone or in the computer I'm using right now. And then you say, oh, what's the most similar word to this word? You get a lot of other lithium-ion battery materials. So that means it's capturing some domain-specific similarities, which is good. But one thing we can do is we can now restrict our vocabulary a bit on this output part and say, instead of saying what words are the most similar, we say what materials are most similar to the keyword. And now this is getting into the kind of hypothesis generation part. Now we can rank material formula by similarity to a given keyword. And this is easy to do because material formula have a very specific structure, so you can identify what words are material formula. Although during training you just treat them as strings, but once you're done with training, you can separate this out. And kind of to generalize this, this doesn't have to be material formula. Like any set of entities, if you have a big dictionary of things you want to rank, you could just use dictionary, let's say names of drugs, for instance. Then you rank materials with similarity to a keyword. So if this keyword is also a material, then this will be a list of similar materials, just like here. But if this keyword is an application, would this ranking be kind of a ranking of materials that are used for the application? And the short answer is yes, but scientifically, like a similarity between an application and a material is not very well defined. You can have similarity between materials or applications. So to deal with this a bit better, we can remember the original task of the word-to-vec model, which was to predict context words given a target word. So now saying our target word is this keyword here, the question is, what are the materials most likely to be mentioned in the context of this target word, which could be, for instance, an application word like a thermoelectric. So you can get these probabilities again by just doing a simple dot product. So you take an embedding for an application keyword like thermoelectric, multiply it by these output embeddings of the materials, and then you rank the materials according to probability of appearing next to keyword in a text corpus. So what this basically says is, how likely is this material to be mentioned in the same sentence with this application? So we did this for a specific application, thermoelectrics. Thermoelectrics are a class of materials that convert heat to electricity and vice versa, or a temperature gradient, to be more precise. So when you do this, you take the word thermoelectric, multiply, you rank, and the first 325 materials are actually known thermoelectric materials, which is good because known thermoelectrics have high probability to be mentioned with the word thermoelectric. But then if you look at another like 326th material, and to give you an idea, there were about 100,000 formula, right? So this is still a pretty high rank, 326. The 326th one is actually something that has never been considered to be a thermoelectric. Is ranked higher than a lot of good known thermoelectrics. So then the question is, could this actually be a prediction or a hypothesis that this model is generating by making some associations? And one way you can test this, and that's also one of the reasons we chose this application, you can actually do numerical simulations to see if this could be good materials for that. So what we do, we treat this as predictions, and then we do computational material science simulations to look at the top 10 here and see what's their computed power factor, which is one indicator if this could be a good thermoelectric material. And then in this plot, on the x-axis, we have the computed power factors, and the green one is the materials that are not known to be thermoelectrics, and the purple ones are the ones that are known to be thermoelectrics. They have, on average, higher power factors as expected, because higher is better. And you see that the top 10 predictions by this unsupervised NLP model have power factors that are higher than the average of all known thermoelectrics, and some of them are even at super high 99th percentile. So as a first validation step, this is good news, because these are not just random embeddings that maybe due to some noise appeared at higher ranking. They're actually materials that computationally seem to be pretty good, but these computations are expensive, so that's why you want to limit your search space. So that's one way to validate it. Another way to validate it, we can kind of think of a time machine. If we went back in time and said, assume we did this in 2008, and we remove all the literature that's been published after that year. I think here I'm saying 2009. So anything that's published after that, it's out. We train the model, we make the predictions, and then we check that if any of the literature after that year that we just removed, this comes true. So, and you can repeat this for every year going back, and then kind of see if what you're predicting is real or not. So here, one example is top 5 from 2009. We had this top 5 materials, and they came up as ranked 1 to 5. And then this material here, copper gallium telluride, is nowadays one of the best thermoelectrics. It's used a lot. It has a very high figure of merit. And in 2009, it would be predicted to be top 5, and it eventually got studied in 2012 and became very well known. There's a couple of ones here. They kind of kept their relatively high ranking until around 2016, 17. They were both discovered for this application. So this is another good test that predictions make sense. So it's one thing to test this retroactively going back, but actually this paper was published in 2019. So now we can go and see if the predictions we made when we published the paper, if any of them have come true. So when we published the paper, we made a top 50 list. So here I have the top 20. And then 2 of them were actually people studied while we were writing the paper. So it's like within 3 months, within 6 months, from January 2019 to July 2019, when the paper was actually published. And then 3 of them have now been reported since the publication. And then this one, we kind of made it ourselves, and the paper just was published about a week ago. And this is actually, maybe this is not a very fair test, because once you publish a list, it's likely that people will go and try to study them. But at least it shows that these are not complete nonsense predictions. It actually makes sense for a group of scientists to go and spend time and study them. So they're meaningful predictions for experts in the field. And once you make predictions, it's also good to think about interpretability, because if you just give a scientist a formula and say this is supposed to be good because my black box model says this is good, it's probably not going to be very interesting, and people are going to want to know why this happened. So one thing we tried here was to interpret these predictions by treating words as nodes in a graph, and then the connections or the edges of the graph would be the similarity between the 2 words. So then you can see these 3 materials are from the top 5 predictions, and they're never mentioned with the word thermoelectric, but they still have high likelihood to be mentioned with this word, according to the model. So we can look at what are some words that have a very high kind of like a very small edge distance, if we want to say it like so, that have a very high likelihood to be mentioned with this word, but also have very high similarity to the word thermoelectric. And we can choose the top words that make this connection. So we see that then this becomes a bit more interpretable. We see that this material, lithium copper antimonide, has some properties that are usually related to thermoelectricity. Or this other material is mentioned with a lot of other known thermoelectrics, so the model thinks that this could also be a good thermoelectric. Or this other material, it's used in applications which are where materials that are used for these applications are also often good thermoelectric. So it's kind of making these connections in various different ways that we as humans would also make. It's doing it in a very automated way. And then I think the question here is, this is only going to work if someone has already studied it and written a paper about it. If you come up with a new material, then there's nothing you can do with this method, and because nobody has written a paper about it yet. But then I think what I wanted to mention is repurposing of a material, or of repurposing in general, is a very common thing, and very often materials are known for many years before they actually become useful for something. So this magnesium diboride was known for 50 years before people found out that it was a superconductor. Or this lithium iron phosphide was known since 1938, and only in 1997 this was identified as a lithium ion battery cathode, and this is one of the highest density lithium ion battery cathodes these days that you can find in many electric cars, where you want high power density per weight or per volume. So, and this is not specific to material science. There is also a lot of repurposing happening, for instance, in pharmaceutical industry, where drugs that are used for one particular disease could also be repurposed for some other disease. So such methods could be used for that as well. And there was a lot of interest in COVID-related research for methods like this, where it's a new disease, but then we have a lot of drugs that could potentially help. So how do we identify which ones are good candidates? So hopefully with tools similar to this one, they're very efficient because you're doing a simple dot product, and they consume a lot of text pretty easily. So maybe we can uncover some of these hidden or lost relationships that's maybe written in some paper that people have forgotten about, but the model can figure out that this could potentially be a good avenue for research, since we cannot really read so many papers. So, and for the last couple of slides, I wanted to talk about what's next. So again, going back to the repurposing, now can we also figure out a way to deal with some out of vocabulary words or materials? And one way to do it could be potentially training like two networks in parallel. One would take a chemical formula, somehow encode it. In this case, it's just a composition, but you could maybe add a structure as well, and then encode it into some embedding. But then in parallel, you could also train your word2vec or some other embedding model. And then you could try to minimize the distance between these two using some kind of dot product loss again. So once you train this together, then your encoder network is in principle generating enough word embeddings for any formula. And then you could use this network to produce embeddings for some new material. Let's say someone made a new material in the lab, and then they want to understand what could be potential good uses for this material. And then they could use the encoder network to figure it out, to build some embedding for it. This is, I think this has been showing some promising results, and the team is working on this already. And then BERT is another interesting model, since BERT came out after we started this work, so BERT wasn't even out then. But you could, in principle, the task of BERT is you mask certain words in a sentence. So in this case, let's say we measured the record thermoelectric figure of merit for rubber thin films, mask, which could be material, and you could ask your BERT model to fill this in. And maybe when it's filling this in, it suggests some candidates that could be good for whatever discovery here or whatever hypothesis here you want to generate. This doesn't have to be an application. This could be any snippets at this point. And then a couple of newer papers, which I found very interesting, is combining some knowledge into parametric models. So in this case, I think both of them are using BERT. So this one is combining knowledge from a knowledge graph with a BERT model, which could make sense in these applications because some things are just facts in material or in any science, and you don't want them to be parameterized. You just want them to be known as facts and known for your model to be aware of it. And similar here, I think combining BERT with some non-parametric memory. In this case, I think this was just a lot of text that you can find the correct answers in text. They used it for question answering. And of course, you could extend this to other domains. So there is definitely some interesting things you could do in improving your hypothesis generation. And I think at the end, I wanted to just highlight everyone who contributed to this. A group of very smart people, and it ended up being a very successful collaboration. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, please let me know. You could also reach out to me there. That's how to contact me here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And by the way, congratulations that your paper been published in Nature. It's huge. If I can, I want to start with questions. I want to take advantage of me being a host.
Sure.
So a couple of questions that I have while you were presenting. One of them, you mentioned that there's different methods of accomplishing similar tasks, right? For example, using transformers lately. But how would you measure, which method is better? What kind of metrics would you use? You had very interesting thing with timeline, the time machine approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this time machine approach is pretty good. You can also make this more quantitative. Here, this is very qualitative, looking at one specific year. But you could also go and do this analysis. I have a couple of backup slides here in case this came up. So here, you could do it kind of as a percentage of predictions that came true over the years and do it for a bunch of years for all the predictions that you make, and this would be this red line here. So say after 17 years, about 40% of whatever you predicted became true, and then you could also compare it to a couple of baselines and say that this works well. So this could be one way to validate, and if your model is doing better, that's good. That doesn't necessarily mean it's uncovering the things that we as humans, it means it's uncovering things that we as humans also think are good ideas, right? Because this is things that we decide to study as well. So maybe this is not the best model to find something that's truly something a human wouldn't think about, which maybe is what we want. For that, it's a bit more tricky because probably the only way to validate it is to actually go and do the experiment. Or another approach was this computational method. Some of these computational methods are very expensive, so you cannot do it for everything. And having a model that allows you to reduce the search space to like a fixed set of materials you can focus on, that could also be very helpful because maybe it identifies a few interesting hypotheses. The human researcher thinks this is good, and then they can go and do a more detailed study. But sometimes uncovering these things from like some papers in 1950s is a difficult task that humans wouldn't think of or wouldn't find. So maybe it can fill in that gap.
Yes, and I do think the timeline approach is genius because you can apply it to almost any science, not just material science.
Yeah, I saw a similar work that was using this timeline approach for COVID. They were predicting if a certain clinical trial would be successful or no, and that was a way to validate if their model was making correct predictions for what could be good. So the model will pick some things for clinical trials, and then they will validate if at certain months think the clinical trial would succeed or not. So yeah, you're right, it can be applied to many things, kind of generalizable.
Another question that I have is kind of tricky. Like, for example, we're looking at this slide, ranking thermoelectrical materials, right? And this slide is not completely textual. There is a graphical data, right? So it's a different modality. And it's very, very, information dense. So if you would consider to extend, your approach, what other modalities would you look at, or encodings?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And for instance, if thinking again about material science, for example, X-ray diffraction spectra are a very important characteristic of a material that in a paper someone would just write, in this plot we show the X-ray diffraction spectrum, and that's it. There's no more description. So or maybe there are some way to describe it, but then without looking at the graph, you really don't know what's going on. So I think methods like this could potentially be useful here, where you combine some kind of knowledge graph that you could build using those X-ray diffraction patterns or additional modalities with your language model, like Word2Vec or BERT, and then make it aware of this and do the predictions. So I don't know a kind of exact step-by-step guide how you would do it, but maybe you could extract your image as, like, if it's an X-ray diffraction, make it kind of find the peaks and then encode these peaks in some kind of a graph or a matrix, and then have this fed into the thing that generates embeddings. And then if it's associated with a certain material using some kind of maybe ontology that you have already built that includes an X-ray spectrum, then this becomes part of the embedding, and then it's useful. This adds a layer of supervision, so it definitely makes it a lot more complicated. I think this method is super simple. It doesn't require any supervision. But once you start thinking about incorporating more information, then it becomes more supervised, but also potentially more useful. I don't know if you could use CNS. Like another more crazy idea could be take a convolutional neural network and then do some kind of unsupervised feature extraction from the graphs, and then also use this as additional features, maybe using captions of the graphs, because you could train it to build the caption of the graph, right? And then there are many tasks that use image captioning as a benchmark. So if you do it on the scientific graphs, maybe you learn how to caption the image, and then every time you have an image, maybe you could build the caption and then have the caption as a part of the NLP model. I don't know, that might help as well. So yeah, definitely an interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is huge potential, especially right now, all this knowledge kind of hidden because most of the material that you will download, it would be text files. But sometimes you can get access to the PDFs. But again, it's hard to parse the PDFs.
Yeah. Especially the older papers where you don't really have the text and you have to do an OCR to get it. And OCR on scientific text is very challenging because there's a lot of domain knowledge to extract. So chemical formula might not come out as chemical formula. So yeah, I think then you have to make it a bit more domain specific and maybe take it one step at a time.
And my last question would be, we already kind of touched it at the very beginning. It's kind of silly, but still I would like to hear your opinion. So you basically created this artificial intelligent researcher, right, that can go into the literature and find the facts, and potentially this researcher produced this intellectual property. So in your opinion, who is, full owner of this property? Is it you or your model?
Yeah, so I don't know if the model can be the owner. We would have to give the model many more features like a name and a version and a legal registration probably, and kind of a status in court and a citizenship and all those things to actually
I mean, corporations have right to present themselves in the court. They're not humans. Corpora.
Yeah, this is getting into very kind of unexplored by me territory of legal consequences of having AI more involved in our lives. I think a very common use case, like common scenario, is with self-driving cars, because it's on everyone's mind, is who is responsible for the self-driving car. There is no driver, so if the self-driving car is in a crash, then it's the company that developed the software covering it, or the company that developed the hardware, or the particular engineer that actually trained the model. And to be honest, I have no idea. I think it's very difficult. It's a very difficult question. It has to do something. I think the most likely approaches, and this is all my opinions, by the way, it's not anything related to Google's approach to this, since I'm not representing Google here. But yeah, I think the people who trained the model and who should be the people who are held responsible if they actually, and the company that deploys this model should be held responsible for whatever the model produces. And if you're responsible, then you're also the benefactor. It's two ways, right? You benefit from it, but there comes responsibility. With power comes responsibility, right? So you can't just deploy it and say, well, it's the model, I don't have anything to do with that.
Very true. Anybody else have questions while we have Vahe? Yep.
Yeah, Vahe, Jerry. Question: what were they doing? What are they doing outside of this, your model, currently to figure out, other materials to look at and things like that? Are they using like chemical structure, similarity, or I don't know, some sort of physical property similarities that would tell them, oh, maybe we should go look at that? And how does your model compare with those more classical approaches, shall we call them?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the kind of the standard approach is using density functional theory calculations, which are the ones that I showed here. But they're usually very expensive. So you cannot, like running it on one material, and might take, like, they're running on big supercomputers, and it takes a very long time to run. And also, usually you cannot compute the final thing you're interested in. Here I show power factor, right? But the most important thing for thermoelectricity is this figure of merit, which is part of it is the power factor. But the reason we don't show the other part is there's just no good way to estimate it computationally that's very reliable. So you get part of the information using this DFT methods, and then you use this to guide it. And then there is also kind of the human expertise component of what people think is good. There are also people who are building, it's a very big field. You would just build a neural network that takes in the composition, the structure of the material, and kind of a data set of some known properties, and then tries to learn how to predict a certain property using the composition and the structure and a few other parameters. The difficulty there is just not enough data sets that have especially experimental values. So the science is mostly in text format, somewhere in publications, and a lot of data sets that you can get are either very expensive or not complete or very small. So there is this issue sometimes of actually having the structured data set. So maybe this helps a bit with that by using some unstructured free-form text data and adds another dimension to the whole thing. But I see this more as kind of a first stage, as give you a few hypotheses, and then from there you can use some human expertise combined maybe with more specialized computations to filter out further, rather than as a method that does all the work and we just have to pick the material.
Okay. How about in terms of, is this being applied at, like, you were at Berkeley, right? Are they taking it to the next level, like people doing their postdocs or whatever type research and things like that?
Yeah, for sure. So the team at Berkeley is still continuing this. There is a website called Mat Scholar, MAT, materialscholar.com. And it's built on top of this. It uses the embeddings or very similar approach. It's using also named entity recognition models on top of it to try to make this information about materials knowledge, it's focused on material science, accessible in a quicker and much more efficient way, and using also methods similar to this one, or using kind of named entity search by extracting names of materials from text, extracting properties, and then giving the user an ability to filter this out. That's only focused on abstracts. I think one of the big hurdles in this is publication text is owned by the publishers. So you cannot, sometimes you cannot access them. And when you can access them, you cannot fully display it. You can maybe use it for research. And there has been a lot of progress in this direction. But still getting access to the data, especially full papers, is a big challenge. So a lot of times it's just abstracts.
It's unfortunate these human systems get in the way of us doing good research.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, like if all the scientific text was fully available,
yeah,
I imagine there would be a lot more interest and progress in this direction.
I guess we need the GitHub of scientific papers or something like that, huh?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
There's a lot of movement in open sourcing science.
Yeah, I have seen some stuff, published lately, but it's mostly out of the computer science realm. It seems to be, right. Where people are, open, various open sort of things that they're doing, especially pre-conference type stuff. So.
Yeah.
There is two interesting movements. One of them is called Unpaywall Me, I believe. Where people can submit the work after it's been published if they believe that work needs to be, more democratized. But another one, Vahe, you probably hear about it. It's Sci-Hub.
Yes.
And it's a little bit, I don't know, touchy subject, if you can put it this way. How do you feel about it?
Sci-Hub, I think it's good to make science accessible, but also we should respect the publisher. So I think doing it in a way that preserves everyone's rights and it's legally right is better than only seeing one end of the spectrum and saying that, okay, it should all be accessible and publishers should not have everything. It's my personal opinion, but also publishers do quite a lot of work to kind of organize the review process, make sure the quality is high, make sure the research is reliable. So there should be some kind of compromise here, which maybe we can figure out a model for sometime soon.
Let me ask you one other question. When you read papers, right, they'll typically say, our method is, X% better than state of the art, things like that. More computer science, but I'm sure this occurs in other fields too. But what happens then, if I were to read the abstract, I would see, the old model, if you will, mentioned in a lot of papers. Let's say they were doing, everything gets compared to BERT, right? These days, BERT, blah, 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 these variants of BERT and things like that. How do you deal with that, not biasing your, since you're using abstracts as your data, not biasing, this one's like mentioned in 5 million papers and this other thing is only mentioned in 500 papers, but maybe the thing mentioned in 500 papers is really a key breakthrough. Have you guys dealt with that sort of issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's actually, in a sense, dealt with here so what happens with word2vec, like you're trying to predict probability that this is mentioned with the word, right? So naturally, if this is a popular material or a popular algorithm like BERT, it's likely to be mentioned in every single paper.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's going to have a high probability. So in terms of word2vec, the way this comes out is you get a vector that has a direction, but it also has a certain length. And the length is usually proportional to how popular this particular material is. So if you normalize the length and only use the direction, which is what we did here, then you're kind of removing this popularity factor from the equation, and then you're focusing really on like the meaning aspect rather than popularity aspect. So that somehow again gets a bit compensated, although you still get, when we did this ranking, this material is the most famous one and the most popular one and the most fundamental thermoelectric, but it's not the one with the highest figure of merit. So it's not the best thermoelectric. And then there is definitely this bias still there. And I'm not sure what would be the best way to get rid of it. Maybe training a model that really uses all the numbers rather than popularity, saying this is what we're optimizing for.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was it. That was my last question.